Hello and welcome back to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming. Today we are going to be doing something a little bit different and taking a look at some huge new reveals and new models coming for Warhammer 40k. As most of us already know, the Tyranids are seeing a huge revamp of their faction, as they are the big launch baddies of 10th edition. And while we saw a lot of new Tyranid monsters show up with that Leviathan launch box, we are now also seeing some new releases that will be coming out around the time of their codex, which were quote-unquote leaked thanks to the Tyranids quote-unquote winning the Battle of Ogham campaign. Basically, a bunch of people who got to play the Leviathan box set could vote online using a code, and well, the intention was that whoever won when you did a matchup against the Tyranids versus the Space Marines, the winner would submit who won, and whoever won the Battle of Ogham would then have a bunch of new releases revealed early, while the other faction would have to wait for their codex to come around this fall. But the awesome people of the Warhammer community banded together, and despite being a few 300 points light on the Tyranid side, the Bugs managed to squeeze out a victory, at least in the polls, for the Battle of Ogham. And we now just have an absolute dump truck of new Tyranid models being poured onto us, and I am wallowing in the biomass. Now, let me give you a little introduction of my background in Warhammer, and also why Tyranids hold a special place in my heart. So when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I went over to my cousin's house one time who's about my same age, and he was into this cool new thing called Warhammer, and he had these awesome little plastic minis that he assembled and lathered thick green paint onto. And I played my first match of Wargaming, which was a rudimentary version of 40k 3rd edition, where basically it was 10 versus 10 Cadians shooting at each other, and it was just kind of 4+ to hit and then make a 4+ armor save, and oh, your guy died or he didn't, and back and forth. Pretty simple and straightforward, but the hooks were in, and you guys all know what I asked for next Christmas. And honestly, I gotta say, I don't think I would have gotten into Warhammer 40k if it wasn't for the Imperial Guard. I love that kind of soldier sci-fi aesthetic that they have, and the idea of humans fending off aliens trying to destroy humanity was a very enticing sci-fi world. So naturally, as a Guard player, the antithesis to my army was, of course, the Tyranids, who had an awesome codex that came out a few years later with 4th edition. And around that time, my soft brain was starting to harden a bit, and I could kind of grasp the rules of Warhammer a little bit better and how to actually form an army and make sense of the rules. So I ended up buying that Tyranid Codex with the intention to start collecting a force. And I actually did end up buying one of the old Metal Broodlord models alongside with it as my first model to get started there. You guys know the one doing the platoon pose with his arms all up in the air screaming. And that year, I think I was about 12, my parents took me on a very, very nice vacation to Hawaii. And man, I absolutely poured over that codex during that vacation. Whenever I was on the flight or sitting inside, I always just had a pen and paper in my hand, writing down different list variations and what I could build my collection off of. Now, that was about the age where I could start appreciating that my parents were taking me to these nice places also. So I have this really fond memory of going to Hawaii as a kid, and then also Tyranids are in there also. Which I guess is kind of fitting. I feel like you could, be in the jungles there and a Hormigaunt would leap out at you or something. I don't know, maybe my wires are just really crossed. However, after that I started middle school and my interest just kind of faded away from little plastic models, and that Tyranid army would never actually come to be. Still, Tyranids always have a special place in my heart, and it's safe to say that someday, maybe when I come up with like a really cool color scheme, I will eventually start a Tyranid army. But obviously I do have a lot of other stuff on my plate right now, including a Guardsman army, which I have probably already bought too many models for. And also, I do really, really love Space Marine Terminators too, so bit of a conflict of interest there. But enough about me, let's talk about Bugs. And I'm going to play a little bit of a catch-up here, and we're going to start by looking at some of the models that came out in that Leviathan box set. I'll try and get through them pretty quickly as they are kind of old news. However, I did get to see all those models in person, and I do want to talk about them because seeing them in person did change my opinion a lot on them. And I do also want to preface this, as it might sound like I'm being really nitpicky, as I tend to be, really. But overall, I do think that GW did a really good job with all these models, especially the revamps of our classics. And while I may not be super hot on some of the newer ones, I think it still does fit in the faction quite well. So between Imperial Guard, I almost said Astra Militarum there, between Imperial Guard and Tyranids, I think GW is getting back on track with some of the more strange stuff we saw with like the Primaris and the Necrons, which for me were extremely hit and miss. But with no further ado, let's jump into the big leader of the Leviathan box sets, the highly offensive Thinking Brain Bug, along with his cohorts who all share one brain cell, who is of course the Neuro Tyrant and the Neuro Gaunts. Now, hot take, I actually really did not like the Neuro Tyrant when I first saw him. I'm not really a brain bug kind of guy, and I kind of always get irrationally triggered whenever I see a big chitinous shell that doesn't actually protect the squishy brain underneath, i.e. malceptors with big holes with brains bulging out their sides. And with the Tyrant, I wasn't really crazy about that big kind of crown that just goes over his brain. It didn't really make much sense to me, and it kind of just looks a little Age of Sigmar-y, if that makes sense. But when I saw this model in person, like many other people, I realized that it was maybe a third the size that I thought it was going to be. He really is quite a small fella, and that actually made me like him a lot more. At that more humble size, that big crown is just a lot less gaudy than I initially thought it was going to be. And of course he is a sketty noodle, which gives him a few points in his favor. But ultimately I think the Neuro Tyrant is just kind of not really my type of bug. I like him, I'm just not in like with him. And honestly, I think that sentiment is going to stand for most of the new models in the Leviathan box. They're all nice and fitting additions to the Tyranid lineup, but none of them really excite me that much, bar one unit that we'll look at later. But again, after seeing the models in person, I think that all the ones that I thought I wasn't going to like were kind of redeemed, and that is definitely the case with the Neurogons here. When I first saw these guys, I kind of hated them. Like, I get what they were going for with this kind of half-form soft shell crab that came out of the biomass pool a little bit too early. And they definitely got that kind of blind mole rat following the synapse instead of using eyes vibe to them, which is cool, but I just don't really like their parasite hat. It doesn't really make that much sense to me. And I don't actually think that Games Workshop knows what the word parasite means when it comes to biological relationships. But whatever. The Neurogons were a cool idea, but I didn't really like the realization of them, at least when it came to the reveal. But these guys were probably the biggest 180 when I actually got to pick them up and hold them in real life, as they are really, really tiny little fellas. They're very small with great detail, and I love the idea of these guys just kind of skulking around while the bigger fauna kind of goes out and does the killing. And I think one of the reasons I didn't really like this model that much when I saw it on the reveal is that I didn't really like the paint job that GW did for it. They're kind of over-detailed, and it makes them look like actual Gaunts rather than these little kind of half-baked creatures. And honestly, they're just really cute little guys. They kind of remind me of popcorn. Like, I kind of just want to take a bunch and, like, pick them up in my hand in a handful and eat them. So, yeah, Neurogons, I actually really do like these guys now. Except for their, like, sergeant guy, like the leader, the node bug or whatever. His model is still a little bit off for me. I don't know. I can't really get behind him. But, again, I still do like the concept of it. But next up here, we have what, in my opinion, is the real centerpiece of this box set, at least for the Tyranid side, and that is the Screamer Killer Carnifex. Now, this one I am extremely bipolar on. I kind of love it, but it kind of drives me nuts, and I kind of hate it also. And I feel like I'm definitely not alone on this. I feel like the communal reaction has pretty much been similar. And overall, I think I'll just jump in there and say it. I think this model is trying way too hard to emulate that OG Screamer Killer. Overall, the body is pretty much perfect, but the head is just kind of a huge swing and a miss. Or maybe not a swing and a miss, but a swing and like you almost got it, but not quite. Like, either give him the wide head with full carapace coverage, or give him the narrow head and make it bald. Don't give him this weird like sideburn thing where he's just got this awkward bald spot on top center. Again, it's that theme of armor exoskeleton not guarding the parts that it should be guarding, which really bothers me. And ultimately, after browsing the subreddits, it seems like the Screamer Killer is the Tyranid's Lord Solar, where it's like 95% a great model, but then the community is like, man, I really gotta fix that 5% myself. And while kit bashing has always been a part of the hobby and making certain hero units unique, I think GW should take note that a lot of these models are being, well, I'll go ahead and say, fixed on a player-to-player basis, because the community seems to be kind of outright rejecting certain design elements that they've gone with. And while I don't want them to just play it completely safe all the time and not try new, crazier things, it definitely hurts in the day and age when we're seeing our kits get more and more monopose, especially with the bigger models. And boy did I, and I think some of the other people in the community, have a massive scare when we saw that Death Leaper with a cape. But we'll talk about that more later. Back to the Screamer Killer. Another major issue I do have with this guy is the arms. I kind of really like them, but again, I kind of also hate them because it's like, how are you ever going to pose this thing in any other way than this pose right here? How do those arms articulate in any way that's not just like a dead spider on its back? So yeah, it looks great in this pose, and I do like it a lot, but it makes me kind of worried about if this thing's ever going to get a multi-part kit, and if it does, is it going to be one of those kits where it's like, yeah, it's going to be a multi-part assembly, but you're going to assemble it the way we want you to, because it's not going to work in any other way. And that's something I really don't want to see normalized in 40k or wargaming, hobbying in general. So when I say a model looks kind of Age of Sigmar-y, that tends to be kind of what I mean. That, or it's more of a diorama than a wargaming piece. Don't get me wrong, those things can be a ton of fun, but I don't want to see that become the mainstay. Just my opinion. But next up here we have the Tyranid Winged Prime. Oh, the Winged Prime. What a great character that is just totally left in the dust. This guy was kind of pitched as like almost the big baddie in that Leviathan reveal trailer, ripping apart a Terminator. But once players got their hand on the box set, he kind of became notoriously like a square peg trying to go into a round hole with the rest of the box. And with no new warriors, winged warriors, or shrikes on the horizon with the new Ogham reveal, it really has deflated this guy a whole lot. The model itself is pretty cool. I don't really like how overly dynamic his pose is. I think it would look great if it was like a part of a, big winged warrior unit at the front in that pose. But again, that's not going to be a thing, at least not anytime soon. That being said, let's say that this guy is a template for the new winged warriors or future warriors to come. I would say he is a great start for that, and I do like the look in that regard. But as is, it's kind of like a winged creature just kind of crawling across the ground like a gorilla, especially if you have multiple of them. It doesn't really capture that nimble flight that he might have. So unless we do get a future unit of winged warrior shrikes and they're all on the ground, not on flying bases, I think this guy is just kind of always going to look a little out of place, which is unfortunate because otherwise it is a fantastic looking model, and if our future warriors end up looking anything like this, I will be very happy. But next up here we have the Psychophage, and this is yet again another one of those bugs where it's just like, there's things I really love about it, and then there's things I really don't like about it. So one, I love that it's like a giant tick, and I love the size of this model. It really fills in that stopgap between the big Tyranid monsters and some of the smaller organisms. I like how its legs are kind of bigger in the back and hoists its big butt in the air. I, however, am not a maw guy. I'm not really into the big gaping mouths of the Tyranids. I think it works on some monsters better than others, but overall, not really my thing. Although I will say this one is a lot better looking than some of the other ones out there. You can make a lot more sense of it, and I do like those rows of teeth inside there. But overall, I think my biggest problem with this model is that you're getting that slight drip of that AOS in there. He's eating that Space Marine hand, so you're always going to have a Space Marine hand on your base. Even if you're fighting something like Eldar, a random Space Marine showed up and got his arm ripped off. Also on top, we have that bellowing smoke. And this is just kind of like too much like the Death Guard releases back in 8th. Like, too much of this model in particular reminds me of a lot of the Death Guard stuff. And if you want to make that the Death Guard's thing where there's always like a cloud of pestilence around them, sure, that's fine. That can be their unique army identity with their models. But here it just kind of feels like GW just couldn't control themselves. They're just like, yeah, let's have some smoke bellowing out the top. We have dozens of other Tyranid monsters that have these kind of spines on their back, but this is going to be the one that's going to have smoke coming out of it. And no, you don't get the option to take it off. It definitely doesn't ruin the model for me, but it's just another one of those things with GW's design choices that really bugs me nowadays. No pun intended. And if this model simply didn't have that Space Marine hand and that smoke on top, it would probably go from a 7 to a 9.5 out of 10 for me. And I know that's not going to bother a lot of other people, but I know I'm not alone in how I feel here. And after a point, all these little things with each of these models did pile up to a certain point where I decided not to buy the Leviathan box set because of it. Like, all of these models individually are pretty good, but it really does just become a death by 1,000 cuts thing where I look at this box and every single model is just not quite there for me, so why would I buy a whole bundle of them? I'd much rather just wait and buy 40 basic-ass Hormagaunts. Okay, so I know that rant sounds kind of aggressive there against Leviathan, but know that's more directed at GW's design philosophy over the last few years. And the frustration definitely stems from a place of love, where these models are almost like It's almost there. Almost perfect. Almost exactly what everyone wants. And the next models that we're going to look at from the Leviathan box set proves that GW definitely has the capabilities to do that, because hot dang are the Von Ryan's Leapers some of the coolest Tyranids we've gotten to date. I love Hormagaunts, I love Lictors, and here these guys just meet right in the middle of the road, and they are pretty much perfect. Their bodies are perfect, their poses are perfect, their heads are pretty much perfect, but their faces just slightly missed the mark for me. Again, GW getting a little too crazy with it. I love feeder tendrils, I love pincer maws, but here you have both, and they're kind of just really clashing with each other. It just kind of looks like a mess, a bit like the Horospecs. And just like people chopping the smoke off the back of the Psychophage, I've already seen people adjusting the mouths on these Von Ryan Leapers. I'm also really not a big fan of the eyes, although it's much more minor. I feel like they wanted to try out a more spider-faced looking Tyranid, but this is not really the Tyranid for that, in my opinion. I think spider eyes would have been fantastic on the Psychophage, but here they are on the Leapers. And you have this kind of great pose where you have these 4 claws on the Leapers that kind of draw your eyes right into the center of them, which is perfect. But then in the middle you just have what kind of looks like a bit of a mess. But fortunately, it doesn't bother me that much because these guys are probably going to get their own multi-part plastic kit, and they'll probably be pretty easy to head swap with. And even if you couldn't do that, I don't absolutely hate the faces. It's not the end of the world. And I think GW did do this to make them a little bit more distinct, rather than just be tiny lictors, which I kind of feel for them with that. So yeah, despite that minor gripe, Von Ryan's Leapers are a huge win in my opinion, definitely my favorite models in the box by a long shot. And when I do inevitably start a Tyranid army, these are going to be some of the very first units that I buy. But next up here we are going to have the Barbgaunts from Leviathan, and this is where things are going to get a little bit contrarian on my part. These guys seem to be the most disliked unit from the whole box set, pretty much across the board. And while I'm definitely not crazy about these guys, I actually do not mind them that much. So the Gaunts themselves I actually do like quite a bit. They have this kind of big lumbering painful look to them. And ironically, while GW calls most of their Tyranid weapons symbiote weapons, this actually does look like the only parasite that Tyranids actually have. These Gaunts' bodies look like they are absolutely tortured having to carry these things around. And for that, I actually do really like the overall aesthetic of these models, including the third leg. I do, however, think the gun itself looks stupid as can be. And unfortunately, that does bring down the overall model for me, and I definitely understand why most people don't like it. However, I did get to appreciate a different perspective when I held the models in real life. They are quite a bit bigger than your standard Gaunt, and I really do like that Games Workshop is filling in these gaps in scale between all these different monsters. It used to kind of just be small bug, medium bug, and big bug. Now it's kind of just a whole spectrum of bug, and that is definitely something that the Leviathan box set has going in its favor. And seeing all of the models assembled in front of me in real life does make me appreciate that more. But for the Leviathan box set, last up, but certainly not least in number, we do have the Humble Termagants, which will segue us into our Battle for Ogham reveals, as a multi-part plastic kit with some additional special weapons was just announced for the Termagants, while the push-fit ones from the Leviathan box are all packing the traditional flesh bore. And overall, while the Tyranid half of the Leviathan box is just a little too wacky for me, it was very reassuring to see the classic Gaunt rebooted in traditional fashion, with a new facelift while still retaining the great aesthetics that we've come to know and love from the Tyranid faction. And these new Termagants are just 100% perfect. There's literally nothing wrong with them. They are exactly what we wanted to see. They're more dynamic, they're more detailed, but they are the Gaunts that we know and love. However, we are seeing the return of some classic special weapons into the Termagant unit with their new multi-part plastic kit. First up here we have the Spike Rifle, which I am quite a big fan of. It lived on in Forge World for a little bit, and this will probably be like your precision sniper or high AP weapon. Probably good for going after targets like Marines, where those little beetles in your gun just can't quite chew through their armor. Next up we have the incredibly phallic Strangle Web. I'm assuming this is going to be a torrent weapon that works kind of like a flamethrower. It even has the kind of tube going around to the backpack, which I think could work out very good with the Tyranid Gaunt's Skulking Horror special rule, though I'd probably have to see the rules first. And last up we have the Shard Launcher, which seems to be a similar, if not the same gun that those Barb Gaunts have, and it kind of makes me wonder why this one is on a regular Gaunt and not that other Gaunt that they seem to kind of parasitically take over, but whatever. And while I didn't like the look of this weapon on the Barbed Gaunt, I really don't like it here because it's quite silly looking, and that gaunt looks very, very forward heavy. But hey, that's what makes multi-part plastic kits so great. I don't have to build that thing at all. Now, overall, I'll be honest, I don't really like the idea of gaunts having special weapons. It kind of feels like they're turning into mirrors of guardsmen, who kind of have their own squad formations when they should just be more of a kind of all-consuming mass horde. And I wouldn't mind if the entire unit got spike rifles and strangle webs as their bio mutation. But I will concede that having the variety there is better than not having it at all, and it is cool to see the return of some classics. But next up we have not just one of my favorite Tyranid units, not just one of my favorite 40k units, but probably one of my favorite alien designs ever, and that is the scissor-handed Hormagaunts. And much like their Termagant counterparts, I have zero complaints about these guys. They are perfect. They're exactly what I wanted. I love them. Their poses are fluid and beautiful, they look fast and ferocious, and I just want to be on a table with 100 of those things on the other end of it coming my way. But next up here we are going to have the Gene Stealers, and just like our Gaunts, these guys have become an iconic visual of the Tyranid faction. And these guys are ultimately almost identical to the classic Gene Stealers, just with much, much more fluid and dynamic posing, which is really something that held back that old Gene Stealer kit more than anything else, in my opinion. Their poses were just honestly extremely silly, with them running forward, flailing their arms in all directions. Meanwhile, these new ones look like they're really running towards you to rip you to shreds with their upper hands, while their lower claws kind of help them maneuver through the terrain and leap over stuff. Maybe grapple you with the lower ones and then slice you apart with the top rending claws. But I especially like the ones in this kit that are either leaping over stuff or actually the ones that are kind of standing still. They look really creepy and menacing when they're just kind of lurking like that. And overall, I've never really been a huge Gene Stealer fan. I know that sounds ironic coming from someone who said their first Gene Stealer model was a Broodlord. But I think it was really the posing of that dated old kit that kind of made me not like him as much, and I've definitely warmed up to them, and I actually really, really love these new ones also. Much like the Gaunts, it's just a faithful reboot, bringing these guys up to par with new stuff like Primaris. But fingers crossed that we can equip this whole kit with feeder tendrils, because I really, really love how Gene Stealers look with the feeder tendrils on them. I think it makes them extra creepy and kind of skulking looking. But we do also have that kind of venom sac looking head in the lower right, which looks like it might be some sort of poison biomorph, maybe a bit of a special weapon kind of thing. And I'm not as crazy on that head as I am with the feeder tendrils, but I think it will look really good with different paint schemes that'll contrast with that green venom more, maybe like Behemoth or something. But do make note that there are no scything talons seen on these Gene Stealers so far, so they may have lost that war gear option. But yet again, the Gene Stealers are another home run, and it's great to see a reboot of the classics brought up to shape. And with new Gene Stealer sculpts and new Terminators, we gotta be seeing some Space Hulk come into the game, right guys? But on to a model that is just long overdue for an update. And I gotta say, it was definitely worth the wait, because now we have a new Lictor sculpt, and hot dang is it perfect. Maybe it's my own personal bias, but the Lictor has always been a massive favorite of Tyranid fans, and the fact that it's taken this long to get a new model or even an update for it is pretty ridiculous in my opinion. I have no idea why that old ugly sculpt was looked over by GW for so long, but that's all water under the bridge now, because we're getting an awesome new Lictor kit with multiple poses that are very true, not just to the original Lictor design, but also some of the old school artwork. And the fact that we're getting multiple different poses out of the same kit for the same monster is really freaking cool. Be it standing upright, flexing those giant talons, or if it's just kind of skulking around, lurking behind the shadows. We're going to have some fantastic options on how to build this. I think you're going to be able to cross over them a little bit and do different things with those kind of mantis talons. And again, GW should be giving us options like this with more kits, because it really just inspires us to buy more than one of the same model, when we as the hobbyists can kind of manipulate them and pose them in the way we want and give each of them their own kind of unique character, versus just having kind of copy and paste diorama pieces. They could have just showed that Leviathan model on the left and I would have loved it, but they showed us the extra posings with that Behemoth one also, and it just makes me so excited for this kit. And unlike the Von Ryan Leapers, they did perfect with that face. Those feeder tendrils are big and hanging, and they're just absolutely menacing looking. I'm going to go all in and just say that this is probably the best looking Tyranid kit that we're going to have for a long time. It's just chef's kiss perfect. Lictor Bros, we won. But coming to us straight out of the left field is another type of Lictor included in that new Lictor kit, and this is going to be the Neurolictor. And this thing is just, I mean, wow, super unique, coming out of left field, unexpected. It looks like a cross between a brain bug and a Ravener, but also a Lictor too. But ultimately, I think this is definitely going to be kind of the black sheep of the Lictor kit, because things like this tend to have kind of niche rules, especially if it's going to be kind of like a Psyker Hunter. But ultimately, at least in my opinion, I think the main reason you're not going to see this as much is because it just simply isn't nearly as good looking. Now, I really, really love the head on this model, despite it breaking my golden rule of having the brain come through the carapace. It just does a really good job of drawing your eyes into this kind of menacing, weird mouth that really looks more eldritch horror than any other feeder tendril we've seen to date. The fact that it has no eyes, but just has these two little fangs and these feeder tendrils wrapped around a hole is just very creepy. It looks like it's just gonna grab you and suck you in there, and you don't know what's behind it all, but you know it's not gonna be good. And also, I do like the way that carapace wraps around the brain a lot more so than something like the Neurotyrants. And the brain itself doesn't totally draw your eyes away from the focal point of its face, so overall the head is just awesome looking on this thing, and I probably would steal that, especially if it's going to be an extra bit out of that Lictor kit, and throw it on some other sort of monster. But beyond that, I'm not really a fan of the rest of this model. One, the pose is very strange looking, and it took me a little bit of time to wrap my head around it. I don't think I'm alone when I say that at first glance, I thought this was like a worm beast like the Ravener. But then you kind of see the legs, and then you kind of have to like make sense of what's going on with it. It's really contorting its body in a very awkward looking direction. And I'm also not really a fan of the weapon combo it has going on. Rending Talons are fine on their own. I'm not nearly as big a fan of them aesthetically as something like Scything Talons, but they can look good, especially when paired beneath larger weapons. But instead this guy has those kind of new talons that look like the Parasite of Mortex arms, and while they work on the Parasite, I think that's because that model is more of this kind of gangly flying beast who looks like he'd swoop down and either grab you or slice you with those things. They just look a little small, and those extra joints on it make it look like there's a little more going on with all of the arms than there maybe should be. But the big new Tyranid feature prevalent on this model that I am extremely not a fan of is that head tentacle. This is the second model we've seen feature that, and I don't know, I think they're going for like a Starship Troopers things where it comes out of the brain and probably stabs into someone else's brain and sucks their brain juice out for, knowledge. But the realization of it on the model just kind of looks ridiculous in my opinion. It reminds me of something you'd see in amateur kit bashing where people have like extra arm bits that they just start kind of gluing on erroneously all around the model. Again, I feel like it's just another area where GW has this good model and they just cannot frickin' tap the brakes a little bit. And combine that with the weird pose and the Parasite arms, and it just gets a little too busy and detracts from that awesome head sculpt, which should definitely be the focal point of the model, especially as a brain bug. But hey, maybe that head tentacle will be an optional upgrade and you'll be able to assemble it without it. If not, you could probably get it off there and just green stuff in some cerebral brain matter. But again, like the Screamer Killer, it's becoming this thing where hobbyists are kind of taking it upon themselves to quote-unquote fix the model. But honestly, if you lose the head tentacle and then maybe change out those Parasite arms, I think this would be a pretty fantastic looking model, even with the kind of funky pose. And that head is definitely my favorite brain bug head to date. But next up we have a model that is neither a Leviathan reveal or an Ogham reveal. It was actually dropped on Instagram when the Warhammer account hit a certain number of subscribers, and this is one that actually had me extremely worried when I first saw it, and this is the Death Leaper. Now, this was revealed right after Leviathan, before any of the Ogham releases, where I was kind of lukewarm on a lot of the sculpts and kind of concerned about which direction the Tyranid line was going to go in. And when I saw this as our new Lictor, I was like, oh no. Oh no, 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 no. Now, let me state that this is a fantastic looking model, but from a design standpoint and the philosophy of how they're going forward with the aesthetics of Warhammer, it's something that just completely rubbed me the wrong way. Now, first off, there is tactical rocks, and then there is full-on diorama bases. And this one definitely crosses the line into the later. This guy's line of sight is already ridiculously tall with those praying mantis talons. And ultimately, the reason this building is so big is just so they can make his cape more dramatic, because at that size, it would probably be dragging on the ground otherwise. And let's just get into it. Let's just talk about the cape. And yes, I know that there's some cephalopods out there that have kind of cape-looking appendages or webbing in between their appendages. But if that's the thought process behind this, I don't think they nailed it, and I think they were trying to do a little bit of both, have the cephalopod cape, but also have him look like Dracula. But ultimately, it just leans way too hard on Dracula cape to me, especially with the rips at the bottom. And overall, it seems way too free-flowing and not really attached to enough appendages to seem like something that would be a biological adaptation instead of just some aesthetic thing. But after that, we do also have the first reveal of that head tentacle thing. Although in this model, it's not really coming out of his head, it's more coming out of his back, which means it's going to be a little bit harder to plug up if you want to do that. And the inclusion of that tentacle definitely made him have more of a hunchback look than I think he otherwise would without it. And while I definitely don't mind the hunchback look, I still don't like the tentacle on the back. It's just very silly in my opinion. It doesn't look good, and I know I'm not alone on that. But aside from the cape, the head tail, and the diorama style base, I actually do like this model a lot. Everything else is very cool. The face and the maw is a little too busy, kind of like the Von Ryan Leapers, but you can make a lot more sense of it than the Leapers, so it does kind of work, although I definitely like the other Lictor's face way more than this one. And overall, with the benefit of hindsight, I do actually not mind this model at all now because I know that we're getting normal-looking Lictors. And I think that this model flanked by 3 Lictors and like a dozen Von Ryan Leapers is actually going to be a really cool detachment on display. So earlier when I was talking about GW trying new things and it's like, you know, don't lock us into the options of the funky stuff, it kind of worked out with the Death Leaper here and the Lictors. You have your standard unnamed Biofleet beasts who are more of gaming pieces, and then you do have your kind of named hero character beast with the Death Leaper. So again, in retrospect, I do not mind that they went out and tried some funky stuff with the Death Leaper, but at first I was super scared that this was going to be the only new Lictor that we got. But next up here, much like the Neurolector, we have another left field monster coming at us. And this is going to be the revamped Biovore and Pyovore, and wow, did they really take some risks on this one and change things up, and I gotta say, I do like it. Now, this is a situation where the old Biovore was pretty frickin' terrible looking, so this is a great place to get out and try something new and go a little crazy with the design. This guy has obviously taken the superior evolutionary route and returned to Crab, and I gotta say, overall, I love it. It looks great. I have, however, always had a problem with bugs with giant guns on their back, and this callback to the old Exocrine kind of model is just kind of looks more like a turret and doesn't look very organic. But then again, neither did it look organic on the old Biovore and Pyrovores, and I feel like it did kind of work out leaning into the cheesiness of those old big back guns. I really like the carapace all over this guy, on the Crab himself and on the gun. It looks really good and looks like it'll be a ton of fun to paint. But unfortunately, guys, I do have some bad news. It looks like the Flood finally got John Halo. Because, Master Chief, you mind telling me what you're doing in that Biovore? Seriously, these spore mines look like little helmets floating around. That being said, I do like them a lot, and I think that kind of fleshy open part in the middle that looks like the visor is going to be really fun to paint in different ways. I think you could do like a nice subdued under the surface glow effect there, and then you also have the veins on top that you can highlight. It's just, this is exactly what you want when you're painting Tyranids. It's such a good switch up from armor and guns and stuff like that in the Imperium. Just absolute peak biomass. But yeah, I really like this new Biovore and Pyrovore model. I think it's a good swing and a hit. Don't touch my Carnifex, and don't touch my Gaunts. But that old Gorilla Biovore? Yeah, go ahead, turn him into a crab. But last up here, we are going to have a big new kit that was teased to us through the lore of the new edition. And this is going to be the massive beast known as the Norn Emissary. And I believe, bar Forge World, this is the largest Tyranid kit we've gotten to date. He's not quite Imperial Knight size, but he is close. And I'll be honest, guys, I don't really know how to approach talking about this model other than just kind of saying, meh. It doesn't really do much for me. And I spent a lot of time staring at this model to figure out exactly why that was. Now, obviously the first issue is that it kind of just feels like a bigger Hive Tyrant, and I think that does kind of detract from its character a lot. But one of my friends kind of summed it up perfectly when we were discussing it, and he said something along the lines of this. It reminds me of one of those third-party 3D printed sculpts that you would see on Etsy, where it all looks really good, it has good detail and it's quality sculpting behind it, but for some reason it just doesn't quite have that character there. And ultimately, I think the reason for that is actually kind of the lore behind this thing translating into the model. What is the point of this beast, aside from just being a larger Hive Tyrant? Well, it's supposed to be an assassin monster that goes after head targets of armies. But isn't that kind of the lictor's role already? But again, after staring at this model for a long time, it does also have some aesthetic issues. First of all, it has my big no-no, which is the brain coming through the carapace. But that's only the beginning of the brain problem. It again calls into question, what is this monster? Is it a giant synapse node? Is it a psychic warrior beast? Is it a brain bug? What's going on? Is it a giant warrior? Because it looks kind of like a giant warrior, not so much a brain bug. So why does it have those giant brain vents exposed? And then aesthetically, pretty much the antithesis of that neurolictor, those brain holes draw your eye completely away from the face of this model and kind of make its focal point really vague. And I've been seeing this happen more and more with Warhammer models recently. The Rogel Dorn also kind of had this issue where you look at a photo of it and your eyes just kind of bounce around everywhere and they don't really lock on to like a front and center like they do with a lot of the older models. And despite how dynamic the poses may be, it does make a lot of these newer kits feel kind of aimless. Now, the fact that those brain nodes on top are also pretty massive, it also means they've extended that head carapace out to a pretty comical degree. And visually, you just kind of get lost in between all the layers of chitin there and where the head starts, where it ends, where the face starts, where's what. It kind of becomes a bit of an amorphous blob of black and purple layers. And I'm going to go ahead and throw out the caveat that this is probably something that's a lot more problematic in the photos than it is in real life when you actually have the 3D sculpt in front of you. But still, I think this model would be way better if they just kept the brain bulging out of the sides and reduced the length of that head carapace by like almost half. And my theory there is really reinforced when you look at the assimilator version of this kit and you see just how clean looking the model is when that head is kind of reeled in and toned down. But all that being said, I definitely don't hate the Norn Emissary. It just doesn't really kind of hit for me, especially for a kit that's probably going to cost you around $200. But I really do like those massive chimney spines on the back, and I love the face on this guy, including his horn piece. It's all very menacing looking. And while you guys know I'm not a fan of the more diorama-like bases, I absolutely love those Tyrannid spine towers. And if there's one type of terrain that should be pre-sculpted into Tyrannid models, it should be their infestation taking over the planet, so I really do like the base on this one. But overall, unfortunately for me, the Norn Emissary is slightly underwhelming for what is supposed to be your end cap to your collection, your big display case centerpiece. The philosophy that led into the design of this model just feels kind of ambiguous and vague. It's kind of just a large hive tyrant / warrior. And once again, it just kind of feels like GW's design team couldn't tap the brakes when designing that head crest and having that brain bulge out on top. But something that is pretty cool and unexpected is the fact that this Norn Emissary is going to have a different model that you can build out of the box, which is going to be the Norn Assimilator, also known as the Assman. And you don't have to look too long at a side-by-side comparison with the Assimilator and the Emissary to see how overcluttered the upper half of that Emissary is. Now, I like the Emissary's face way better than the Assimilator's face and his little bunny ears. But the overall silhouette of the model just looks so much cleaner on the Assimilator, and the upper half in particular is just so much more pleasing to the eyes, in my opinion. Now, I think I would kind of like that Queen Alien face and head crest, more so than the more Genestealer looking head on this big monster, but it definitely needs to be way more reeled in than the Emissary's head crest. But maybe we'll have options to make a happy middle in the actual kit. And honestly, if I could swap that double-pronged horn for a single Butcher Blade style one that the Emissary has, I'd be pretty happy with the Assimilator. But he's still not quite perfect for me to justify spending $200 on. First of all, the flesh hooks on the chest are just a really kind of dated aesthetic for the Tyrannids, and I thought they were steering away from that now. The idea is that these things shoot out, grab nearby prey, and pull them in, but it never really worked on the model because, well, they're not modeled with prey nearby. So they always just kind of stand there with a bunch of funky looking branches coming out of their chest that don't even really look like hooks or something that would, fly out and grab something. And I always thought that was mostly because on the warrior scale, they were so small that you couldn't make them any smaller without them just kind of being, easily breakable. But here we have the Assimilator with the exact same hooks just scaled up to an absolutely gigantic size, and they look the same, and they're just as unconvincing as ever. But fortunately, it looks like you probably don't need to glue these guys on at all. It won't affect the model. They just go right on top of the existing exoskeleton there. So overall, that's not too big of a deal. But next up, probably one of the bigger problems of the Assimilator is what I'm going to go ahead and coin as the secondary weapon effects of Games Workshop, where you have vehicles like, let's say, the Tau Hammerhead, where Yeah, there's options, but the other option just feels like such an afterthought that they kind of didn't design it to be very aesthetically pleasing. And it kind of feels like they assume that no one's going to use it, so they don't put as much effort into it. It's just kind of there to say that there's options, and that's the harpoon talons that this guy has. I really don't know how to say it any other way than they just look really bad. And I love the concept of harpoons in Warhammer 40k, and especially with biomass beasts like Tyranids. It honestly makes a lot more sense than something like guns on them. But between the flesh hooks and this, there's just gotta be a way to better represent that visually on the models. And if I did buy this kit, I would probably end up building something that's like halfway between an emissary and an assimilator, because there's parts I like to both kits, and there's parts I really don't like to both. And I don't know, the whole thing just feels a little half-baked for a giant $200 centerpiece kit, if that makes sense. And I'd really hate to end the video on a downbeat note like that, because it sounds like I am really trashing this new line, when actually I am really quite happy with the releases, and I think they did a great job with most of the monsters here. There's just a lot of design decisions and choices made that I don't really personally like. And while I don't necessarily think that any of those are bad models because of those decisions, it's also definitely keeping me from wanting to run out and spend my money on them. You know, there's models in Warhammer you collect because you love how they look, and then there's models you buy in Warhammer because they're a part of your faction and they work well in it. And I think a lot of these new models do fall into that later category. However, I am remarkably happy with our new Gaunts, Gene Stealers, and Lictors. And despite all my gripes, I do think this is one of the best reboots and release waves we've seen in a long time. And for someone as picky as me, it's great because the units I do have to buy for a Tyranid faction look great and I love them. And then the ones I don't like, guess what? They're monsters I don't really have to buy. And that, in my opinion, does constitute a really good line reboot for a faction. And overall, I do think it's a great time to be a Tyranid player, whether you're buying new monsters to expand your collection or starting from scratch with these beautiful new Gaunts. And I'm definitely looking forward to the future releases in 10th edition. But this, of course, is my highly opinionated take on this release. Let me know what you guys think about the new Tyranids in the comment section below. Do you agree or disagree? Give reasons why. Consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications. I will be doing more Warhammer videos in the future, along with continuing my bolt action unit guide. And I am considering starting a new series on paint guides. So if you're into any of that, do stick around, and as always, until next time guys, take care.